I'd like to introduce Dr. Samantha M. Cooper, who is the Ariel and Joshua Wiener Family Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, where she is working on her first monograph, American Jews and the Making of the New York Opera Industry, 1880 to 1940. Samantha received her PhD in historical musicology at NYU. Her articles have appeared in the Opera Quarterly, American Jewish History, and the Journal of, sorry, my brain just went blank, the Journal of Society for American Music. Samantha's scholarship was awarded the Wiley Housewright Dissertation Award and the Jewish Studies and Music Study Group Award. She is the producer and host of the Sounding Jewish podcast and the co-executive director of the Jewish Music Forum, a project of the American Society for Jewish Music. And just as a reminder, when Samantha is done speaking, we'll have time for questions, and then we'll bring up the next speaker. So everyone, join me in welcoming Samantha.
Thank you so much. Okay, so some of you pretty recently heard the initial version of this presentation, and this one is similar, but hopefully there will be some new takeaways today. So thank you so much again for having me with you. Okay, so let's begin. On December 3rd, 2006, Israeli Hasidic cantor Yitzhak Meir Helfgott gave a concert accompanied by the New York Philharmonic for a packed audience at New York's Metropolitan Opera House under the auspices of a not-for-profit organization called Cantor's World. I've managed to track down a bootleg recording of this concert, so let's give a few minutes of Helfgott's performance from the evening a listen. Before and after the event, media coverage boasted that this concert by the Jewish Placido Domingo would make history as the first cantorial concert to take center stage at this magnificent venue. Yet, as I will soon demonstrate, this claim was incorrect. While Helfgott's cantorial concert was the first to take place on the stage of the Met at Lincoln Center, it was not the first to unfold on the stage of New York's Metropolitan Opera House. My paper today sets out to verify the aspirational but largely undocumented history of the relationship between synagogue cantors and the Met. This investigation necessarily builds on a great deal of extant literature by musicologists and Jewish historians, many of whom are with us in this room today, with close ties, who have talked about the close ties between the synagogue cantorate and the opera. So, of course, we have Mark Slobin's Chosen Voices, Judah Cohen's Jewish Religious Music in 19th Century America, and Jeremiah Lockwood's most recent Golden Ages. And these are just some of the many books that recognize the connections between this art form and their practitioners. However, we also have additional book chapters and articles by Jeffrey Chandler and Ron Raboy, who's with us today, which document similarities between cantors and opera singers, chosen repertoires, and vocal approaches. So I think in all of this, the genre of opera has loomed large in the cantorial imagination, with cantors' performances of acclaimed arias at once constituting the idealized pinnacle of a successful vocal career and the embodiment of a threat to secular culture, of secular culture to Jewish traditional life. However, what I found is that no in-depth study of cantors' encounters specifically with the secular Metropolitan Opera House have been previously conducted, and so that's what I'm setting out to do. Today, I'm going to use press coverage, audio recordings, archival clippings, and memoirs to substantiate an enduring cantorial relationship with New York's first and second Metropolitan Opera Houses. After examining the 3 cantorial concerts that predated Helfgott's 2006 performance, I'll present evidence of a number of cantor opera singers who served in the Met's cast and chorus at various times between the opening of the first institution in 1883 on Broadway between 39th and 40th Streets and its present-day home now, better known at Lincoln Center. Next, I'll uncover the role that cantors and opera singers played in the Met's voice studios and their role in educating the next generation of cantors. And then I'll conclude with a meditation on both the proposed and actualized cantorial fundraisers and life cycle events that took place on the Met stage. While this investigation is still in its early stages, I hope to show you that the close connections that many scholars claimed existed between cantors and the Met can be verified with ample documentation and traced through the historical record. In the process, this project recognizes the central role that this national institution played and continues to play in facilitating Jewish boundary crossing between the sacred and secular musical realms. So, the first 3 cantorial concerts at the Met. The first cantorial concert at the Met actually took place in the early 1920s. Between 1920 and 21, 3 famous synagogue cantors from Eastern Europe performed concerts there. First, we had Yosele Yosef Rosenblatt, Zebulon Zabel Korten, and Gershon Sirota. These cantors, who had all recorded a substantial number of commercial recordings in Europe and eventually in the United States, during what is today extolled as the cantorial golden age of Jewish sacred music, became the equivalent of musical superstars in the Jewish world. Each, as Daniela and Jeremiah and many others have told us, was labeled a Jewish Caruso in their own right, much like the Jewish Placido Domingo of earlier, revealing how, as music scholar Mark Slobin put it, cantors continue to use opera as the yardstick by which to measure their success. Their performances at the Met were part of international concert tours, which took these cantors to synagogues and concert halls across the country. So we'll start with Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt's debut at the Met was initially scheduled for 1918, soon after he famously refused General Director Cleofonte Campanini of the Chicago Opera Company's request to play the role of Eliezer in Halevi's La Juive for $1,000 a night. On December 20th, 1918, a reporter for the Hebrew Standard wrote with great anticipation about his upcoming performance, saying, quote, "Those who scoffed when they read the reports of Cantor Rosenblatt being offered an engagement by the Chicago Opera Company will now have to retract, for the famous cantor will be the soloist at the Metropolitan Opera House concert next Sunday night. This announcement means that our co-religionists will pack the house, for they will have an opportunity of hearing their idol sing folk songs in Yiddish, some of his own liturgical compositions in Hebrew, and an attempt in Italian." However, this concert did not materialize. Rosenblatt reportedly became ill, and the concert had to be rescheduled. When he did finally make his Met concert debut nearly 2 years later, on Sunday, January 11th, 1920, he performed his own arrangements of Jewish repertoire and also sang 2 secular songs, Luigi Denza's Si vous l'avez compris and Josephine McGill's Duna. Though other opera singers also performed in this concert, which was in the vein of the Sunday evening performance concert tradition, which had long taken place at the Met, Rosenblatt was actually recognized as the chief attraction of this evening. Cantor Zabel Korten's concert at the Met took place on April 27, 1920, for a 4,000-person audience. Though both secular and Jewish news outlets praised Korten's concert, noting the repeated ovations and robust applause he received at the beginning and the end of the evening, Korten's reflections in his Yiddish-language memoir paint a vastly different picture. From Korten's perspective, everything that could possibly go wrong did go wrong, at what he labels his unsuccessful concert at the Metropolitan Opera House. Upon learning that he would be giving his first concert in the United States at the Met, Korten was immediately anxious about the selection of venue, saying, "I was fearful of the opera house, and the larger it was, the greater was my fear." Other factors that conspired to make Korten's American debut a disappointing one included his inability to secure a conductor with whom he had previously sung, his contracting of an illness following his exhausting international travel, the lack of rehearsal time with his new conductor and choir, the discomfort of wearing evening clothes instead of his usual cantorial garb, and the disconcerting nature of the Met's acoustics. He describes the experience of singing in the Met as follows. "For a moment, I felt that I was not Korten. I could not control my voice at all. I already felt clearly that my voice was somehow veiled, soundless, and not resonant. I was filled with indescribable fear. All of it was not that which the audience expected from so highly publicized Chief Cantor Zabel Korten, whom they knew so well and loved through his phonograph records. After finishing the first section, I came backstage as a broken person." Ultimately, Korten characterized his debut at the Met as the most mournful concert of his life, a total failure, and the greatest tragedy that had ever struck him in all his long career as a chazan. So a little dramatic. Corton was most proud of his daughter, coloratura soprano Anna Corton's performance of art songs, reflecting that her success that evening was greater than his own. So let's give Corton singing a piece from his debut of Harachamim a listen now. Okay. You can do it. Oh, okay, here we are. The following year, Cantor Gershon Sirota began his second American concert tour at the Met on Tuesday, March 15th, 1921. At this sold-out institutional debut, Sirota appeared alongside his son and pianist Naftali Sirota, his daughter and soprano Helena Sirota, and a 100-person choir conducted by Mayor Machtenberg. As Musical America joked, the answer to solving the Opera House's financial difficulties might just lie in hosting more cantorial concerts. Quote, "The stage looked like a garden of flowers, transformed by the countless wreaths of flowers and bouquets of roses that his admirers presented to the hero of the evening and his daughter in advance of their appearance. With such cantorial concerts, Gatti Casazza could easily eliminate the chronic deficits at the Met." As the surviving concert program attests, Sirota sang a number of Hebrew and Yiddish songs, and though he initially seemed extremely nervous and ill at ease, he was eventually able to relax and sing with more freedom of tone and emotional abandon. And I'll just point out here that this program comes from the Harvard archives, not the Met archives. They have no record of this concert ever happening. So while I was flipping through the pages of the Met Opera House collection at Harvard, this came to my attention. So it's kind of an interesting narrative of having to piece the puzzle together from different institutional collections. Even as Sirota's concert attracted Jewish and non-Jewish audience members, ranging from Arturo Toscanini to Cantor Rosenblatt, Musical America reported that co-religionists of the famous Hebrew singer were in large majority. They made their presence known by shouting their approval when the cantor propelled stentorian high notes of clarion quality or achieved some particularly amazing bit of rapid vocalism, often interrupting the music by their outbursts of spontaneous approbation. And this is one of the reviews he received. Reviews of the performance were especially complimentary. The Jewish exponent noted that the great audience that listened in rapt attention and the cantor's authoritative and powerful singing of synagogal airs, Hebrew liturgical music, and Yiddish folk songs. And Helena, too, was complimented on her pleasing, if modest, debut in Jewish folk songs and her performance especially of Eli, Eli. Together, these three early Met cantorial concerts attest to a gradual recognition of the virtuosic capabilities of the cantorial voice by Jewish and non-Jewish publics alike. Whether perceived by their featured artists as successes or failures, they nevertheless capture how even synagogue cantors, the embodiment of Jewish religious sonic difference, could gain acceptance if granted the pinnacle of American concert stages on which to perform their craft. Turning now to the Met's cast and chorus, a pairing of Jewish and secular press coverage with performance logs available through the Met Opera database confirms that at least 16 cantors were cast in roles at the Met. And this is an update on my previous list, where I think I had 7 or 8 at the time. If we accept unsubstantiated claims made in the Jewish press about an additional 13 cantors, and let's move to them, who most likely also participated in the children's or general chorus, then this number climbs to at least 29 cantors. Already, again, this is a number that's up, but I'm still collecting information about all of this. So if you know of other individuals who are not on these lists, please let me know, and I'll give you a sec to take a look first at the list, and this is the one with singers who are not in the Met Opera Archive database, and this is the list of singers who do make the database, and we know were cast in roles at the institution. Often the only evidence I have that simultaneously links these men to specific synagogue congregations and the Met are, again, newspaper clippings, like the ones displayed here, or advertisements for upcoming high holiday or Passover appearances, like these ones. Though the cantorate has long been an almost exclusively male space, there were also women, of course, who served as cantorial soloists at their respective synagogues and performed at the Met as well. First, we have contralto Josephine Jacobi, who worked as a soloist at New York's Temple Emmanuel before pursuing an operatic career that later included 9 seasons at the Met between 1899 and 1908. and most recently mezzo-soprano Mimi Lerner, who sang one season at the Met in 1991, and then worked as a cantorial soloist for Rodef Shalom in Pittsburgh. And though there are other women who sang in both synagogue choirs and at the Met, like Viola Philo and many others, for the purposes of this study, I'm just going to limit the pool of those included to those who are referred to by the language of cantorial soloist, because I think that especially merits their consideration alongside the numerous men I've already highlighted. Moving now into the realm of teaching, we find that while the Met is not often recognized as an educational institution, in addition to a performance venue, this was also a significant function that the Opera House played for a host of adults and children who participated in the Met ballet and choral schools. The studios above the Met likewise housed several Jewish voice teachers, both those who were celebrated and those who were virtually unknown, who rented space there to ensure direct access to their main clientele. One of these studios above the Met was rented to composer, pianist, and cantor Henry A. Risotto, who was born Chaim Netzvitsky, and he was a Jewish emigre from Belarus who marketed his singing school above the Met in Yiddish newspapers in 1915 and 1916. He specialized in teaching private and group singing, sight singing classes, so that was his claim to fame. In an interview with the Musical Courier, Risotto claimed that after enrolling in 3 of his lessons per week for a total of 6 months, he could virtually guarantee his students the ability to read well at sight. This skill, Risotto maintained, was especially important, quote, when the musical manager or operatic impresario presents an unknown musical selection to the young aspirant for a position. So he linked knowing how to sight read directly with operatic career goals. Between 1940 and 53, the Cantors Conservatory of America opened in the studio apartments above the Met and promptly began advertising its training program for aspiring cantors in Der Tog. The CCA, one of many piecemeal efforts to institutionalize the study of cantorial singing before the formal establishment of seminary schools in New York, remained active into the late 1940s under the direction of Ukrainian emigre composer and cantor Louis Lipitz. And finally, in 1968, former Met opera singer and cantor Giulio Gari began advertising his own voice lessons specifically for cantors in Der Tog. So again, we have synagogue, we have opera singers from the Met who are then teaching and advertising their services directly in voice to cantors. And later I can show you evidence that they were actually taken up on that offer. In addition to cantorial concerts, the Met housed about 80 Jewish events, from fundraisers to birthdays and wedding celebrations that I discuss at length in my forthcoming book. But a handful of these events were interfaith, and part of what Jews were invited to do was participate alongside Protestant and Catholic representatives, and often cantors were co-opted to perform in these events. So, for example, at the Hudson-Fulton reception held at the Met in 1909 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the discovery of the Hudson River and the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's invention of the steamboat, Rabbi cantor Henry Pereira Mendez was invited to give the celebration's closing prayer. And similarly, as the Hebrew Standard highlighted in December 1918, a feature of the recent celebration of Jerusalem's deliverance from Turkish rule at the Metropolitan Opera House, this city, was the singing of the Cantors Association of America. And this is not the same as the CCA that I mentioned before that had its training studios above the Met a little bit later on, because there were many of these piecemeal cantorial education efforts, as Jeremiah can probably tell us all more about. Though the cantor's performances were somewhat foreign to the organizer, he nevertheless wrote the participants a very nice thank you note that was printed with the press. So he says, quote, "Please convey to the members of the Cantors Association of America my heartfelt thanks for their present participation in Tuesday evening's celebration. Their singing was superb, and while I must confess regrettably my inability to understand the words, the thrill of the music went through me, and I noticed its effect upon the audience with great pleasure. We shall be proud in years to come of having joined in this fraternal way in thanksgiving to God for deliverance of a land to serve us all." The treasure trove that is the Jewish press also captures the plans for one event with a cantor at its center that ultimately never happened. So I like to think that these events are still informative and can tell us something. So in 1932, a committee apparently planned a concert in honor of Yosela Rosenblatt's 50th birthday. And initially, the concert was supposed to take place on May 8th at Madison Square Garden, and then at the cantor's request, it was moved to the Met and then deferred until May 22nd after Passover. However, before the concert, Rosenblatt then told the organizers, with the help of his attorney, that the planned concert did not meet with his approval, and he would not be present to sing. He gave no reason for revoking his support, and the event was then called off. Predictably, the Jewish and non-Jewish press soon printed totally different explanations for Rosenblatt's cancellation of the event. The New York Times claimed that Rosenblatt had proposed the celebration in his own honor and then reneged on his contract, while the American Jewish World claimed that Rosenblatt had only backed out of the event after learning that the organizers were planning to benefit from the concert instead of him. What the real story was, we might never know, but the truth probably lies somewhere in between. In any case, no pun intended, the centering of the Met in the plans for this cantorial concert that never was can still tell us something about the alluring place of this particular venue in cantorial history. There is additional evidence that on at least one occasion, the Jewish Ministers' Cantors Association of America and Canada rented out the Met for its own celebration. In December 1947, the association hired the Met to mark its 50th anniversary celebration and Hanukkah, while fundraising for a cantorial training school in the US. An ensemble of 250 cantors sang soloists and liturgical music, and the concert attracted an audience of 3,500 people. Famed composer of Yiddish theater music, Joseph Rushimsky, conducted the choral numbers at this concert, and Cantor Leibglantz was one of the soloists, he claims, the following year. And of course, the Met also housed less than happy occasions in Jewish cantorial history as well. Following cantor and Met tenor Richard Tucker's death, his funeral was then held on the Met stage on January 10, 1975. His funeral was the first to be held for a singer in the Met's 90-year history, though it is interesting for our purposes to note that the other two funerals held at the Met were also for men of Jewish descent. First, there was impresario Leopold Damrosch's funeral in 1886, right after he started his first year with the Met and then passed away, and Heinrich Conried in 1908, another Jewish impresario. Much like Conried's funeral, the Met employed its operatic set pieces as functional decor at this funeral on the stage. And so they say Tucker's mahogany coffin, wrote a reporter for the New York Times, was placed on a cafalesque in the middle of an almost bare stage. The coffin was flanked by huge bouquets of chrysanthemums in the autumnal colors of brown and gold, and on the left of the stage, 6 ballroom chairs from the first act of La Traviata were set up for the participants in the ceremony. The ceremony was conducted by Rabbi Mordechai Waxman of Temple Israel in Great Neck, Long Island, with psalms sung by Cantor Benjamin Siegel. And the service concluded with Cantor Herman Malamud singing in Hebrew the high wailing notes of El Mole Rachamim, the traditional Hebrew prayer for the dead, before the great golden curtain closed slowly. This performance at Tucker's funeral would mark Malamud's first at the Met, only a few years before he officially joined the company in 1981. And in the Met Opera database, you can actually see that his singing at this funeral is marked as his first performance at the venue, and then you can see his debut a few years later. And so I'll wrap up now. Evidently, the historical record substantiates a lengthy relationship between cantors and New York's Metropolitan Opera House. From cantorial concerts and crossover performers to educational initiatives and events, the Met served a variety of vital and vibrant purposes for synagogue cantors. While cantors might have used the Opera House as a method of evaluating their vocal success, the Opera House also made space for and relied upon opera singing cantors to fill its stage and studios. Moving from shul to the Met, and back again, cantorial opera singers and opera singing cantors were a much more ordinary part of the institution's landscape than has ever before been realized. While this narrative is necessarily a gendered one, it also leaves space for further consideration of women who may have covertly filled such roles alongside their male counterparts. And now, before I let you go, I'd like to just draw your attention to one final recent example of an assistant cantorial soloist who is the most recent on the list to have performed at the Met. Countertenor, or should I say cantor tenor, Aryeh Nussbaum Cohen, born in 1994, was raised in Brooklyn in a Jewish family. After singing in Synagogue with the Brooklyn Youth Chorus and the Jewish International Youth Choir Hazamir, the 12-year-old Nussbaum Cohen was asked to serve as the assistant cantor at East Midwood Jewish Center during the high holidays. He subsequently spent 9 years in this role. Only after winning a free ticket from Princeton's music department to attend La Boheme at the Met did Nussbaum Cohen decide to shift from a major in public policy to history with minors in Jewish studies and music. After winning the Met Opera National Council audition grand finals in 2017 and a Sarah Tucker study grant from the Richard Tucker Music Foundation, Nussbaum Cohen debuted as Rosencrantz in the Met's U.S. premiere of Brett Dean's 2022 production of Hamlet. I'll give the final word now to Nussbaum Cohen. So here he is, singing the boy soprano solo in Gerald Cohen's Adonai Roi, which is incidentally the same solo I sang with my youth choir in Toronto while he was taking this role on tour with choirs throughout New York. All right, and I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation. Is there any, how exceptional is this part played by cantors? Is there any other religious tradition, like the Black Gospel tradition, that has such a concerted presence at the Met, or any other religiously based cohort of singers who can be found there? Or is this just a complete and total outlier?
I think in some respect this is a complete and total outlier, which I'm hesitant to say because obviously without doing the research on any other religious groups, I can't speak to that absolutely. But as I was doing this work, I did come across one or two examples of church cantors for our purposes that were in similar roles of going back and forth between the Met and their institutions that they served. But I didn't see anything on this level of institutional duration, like that lasted decades and sort of spanned backgrounds. So we had cantors who are from the Sephardic tradition and Ashkenazi tradition and coming from all different places and spaces. And even, I'll show you some of the fun extra slides I found. So we have advertisements in the Jewish press for synagogues who are saying that they should come, you should come and pray and play with us because we have a new cantor who is sung both on Broadway and with the Met Opera. So like these kinds of direct ties, I think, in the ways synagogues are billing themselves, in the sort of communal prominence of this story, I think is pretty specific culturally. But again, I would be hesitant to say absolutely without doing that additional digging. But it's a really good question.
Ma'am, please. On that subject, I think it's interesting to think about some of the African American opera singers who came from gospel singing, came from their churches, who weren't representing their churches, as a member of the Metropolitan Opera, but came from that tradition of singing in the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
As part of preparing them to be opera singers.
Though I should say, and just preface the conversation about African American singers in general with the note that because of the Met's practices before the 1950s, African Americans were not given the same opportunities on the Met stage as cantors who could pass for white Christians were, like the ones I've kind of highlighted today. And so, it's the situation that there were some African American dancers that slid their way into performance on the Met stage, but this sort of overarching narrative of continuous back and forth was not possible before 1950 for African Americans the way that somehow it was for Jews.
Can I add a question just on that theme? What does this project tell us about the material realities for cantors and how they made their money? I mean, I'm interested by the fact that they're sort of using these performances as part of self-promotion, which is also promotion for their congregations, which is also promotion for their schools. So can you just tell us a little bit about what you've learned about the kind of material reality of the life of a cantor having done this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would have to just point to the fact of change over time, which I think is always the narrative as we have to unravel it historically. But again, I'll point to the additional slides. So for instance, in the case of Richard Tucker, we have initially the responsa with three of the rabbis who, there was a vote at the synagogue he wanted to work at before he took on his Met Opera role. 3 out of 5 voted that he should step down from his position as cantor if he wanted to sing at the Met, and so he did. And this is the response of one of those rabbis, and obviously Mark Klickman and I have talked about the fact that what is reflected in responsa is probably the most strict end of the religious spectrum, and that doesn't always reflect the historical reality. But then, only a year or so, or maybe 30 years or so later, we have congratulatory messages to Richard Tucker from the Park Synagogue for hitting 25 years singing for the Met. So there is this change over time that's very clearly demonstrated when you look at the historical record. And I think there was one more. Yeah, no, it's just the We Pray, We Play. Okay, cool. Yeah, so, I think, but also I think thinking about the financial aspects of being a cantor, the precarity of that position, the fact that many of these opera singers were taking on solo gig cantorial roles, for assorted holidays, Passover, the high holidays, what have you, at in the Borscht Belt, at hotels and the Catskills, on all of that narrative to supplement their income also tells you something about the precarity of opera singing in general. Yeah, and so keeping that narrative in mind is pretty important, and yeah, I think that's sort of a good place to leave that thought, but thank you.
Just to say that this fascinating chapter it's a really small, it's just one chapter in the huge book of Jewish Americans' involvement with classical music.
Exactly.
And the enormous pride that communities took and keep writing about in their newspapers, like any connection with the local symphony orchestra, with national, classical music prominence. It just goes on and on and
Totally.
on. It's very, very deep in the United States back to, probably early in the 20th century, and maybe even back beyond that. So, I think you'd have to look at the whole classical music
Yeah, absolutely.
structure, and then this is like such an
These are
extraordinary
pieces.
special link
Right,
they
it's
could
just a
make
little piece.
because of the role of the cantor.
Totally. Yeah, and I think this is, the whole idea behind this paper was the concept of the truism, that we always just say that this is true without ever backing it up, and I was like, well, I think we can. Let's do some digging and excavate here and see if this is actually true. And on the idea of this being a little small piece of the pride in classical music story, in my book project, I have a chapter devoted exclusively to opera singers who were performing in New York, with and without some of the cantors on this list. But one of the sections of that chapter looks at the stories in the press that are cultivated about the discovery narratives of finding the brilliant opera singer, and all of the different iterations of that story as they are unraveled in the press narrative. So the lingerie opera girl, lingerie selling opera girl, or the truck driver opera singer who's discovered and promptly shuffled into operatic training. So these kinds of discovery stories are also pretty prominent in the Jewish press. And again, it speaks to, a tiny little part of the much larger story of pride in classical music involvement.
Regarding what Mark was saying, of course, it's not just in the U.S. that there was this connection with classical music.
Exactly.
As Jim Leffler has written about, in Russia too, for example. But just the perfect story is there's a Sholem Aleichem story, Often Fiddle, on the violin, in which he's talking about, I think it's in that, it's in that story, that there was somebody teaching kids to play, and Sholem Aleichem's persona as the narrator talked about listening at the window, and this violin teacher would say, yes, and Paganini was a Jew too.
Yeah, exactly. And there's even, I have a colleague who's working on stories from the Holocaust era in Yiddish, and she's found a whole collection of children's stories directed at Jewish children on Beethoven. And they basically describe Beethoven like he is this Jewish, relatable figure for Jewish children, like, looks in the mirror and wonders why his curly hair, he can't get it under control. And it's these very funny, moments of trying to see oneself through the vein of classical music, even, of course, when the canon has nothing to do with Jews, that specifically. So, yeah, it's a very interesting story that has legs much further on and back and forth in different arenas.
All right, I'm going to give the last word to...
Just a short question. I was intrigued by the sight singing ad by Russotto.
Totally.
Of course, when
Yeah.
I first encountered Russotto, when I first started looking at this, who is Henry Russotto?
Exactly.
Why does he
Right.
involved in the Yiddish theater? And then obviously found out later why. So do you have any thoughts on why the sight singing in particular? Obviously the Italian, flair of the name contributes to the credibility, potentially, if people didn't actually know what his background was. But just comment on the sight singing, if you can.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that for me, the part I was... the context for discovering the sight singing was first noticing that his studio was in the Met, and then I was thinking, okay, who is this man, and is there any chance he might be Jewish? And then, of course, it comes out that his name is Chaim, and that clears that up pretty quickly. But I was looking at the Met studios in the context of trying to figure out what the pedagogy scene in and around the Met Opera was and how Jewish people were involved in that more broadly, because for me, that's a whole chapter of telling the New York opera history story, is thinking about how are we teaching opera, who is doing the facilitating of that educational process, not just in like popular spheres like performance at the baseball stadium or at Madison Square Garden or that kind of thing, but really he was doing the day-to-day teaching of opera-adjacent practices to people in New York at the time. And so this discovery of Henry Risotto or Chaim Nachovsky or whatever we want to call him, is just part of that pedagogy story. And I think it's an interesting piece we can break off and place into the context of the cantors doing this training, but it is also part of the story of opera pedagogy in New York at the time. Yeah.
Amazing. All right, well, let's give another round of applause to our incredible presenter. Thank you so much.